Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this latest UK District Energy Association event. Today we've gone non-technical for once, and we're focusing on contracts and agreements because we felt that was an area of the sector that wasn't commonly focused on. So we've got a brief session this morning with 3 speakers. So sit back, relax, have a cup of tea, and hopefully in an hour and a half you'll find out a lot more or know a lot more about contracts and agreements. So I'm Simon Woodward. I'm the chairman of the UK District Energy Association. Just a brief couple of slides telling you about us if you've not come across us before. We are a non-trade, non-for-profit association. We were set out by a group of local authorities over 10 years ago in 2010. And our role in life is to offer guidance and support and to raise awareness of district energy as a low carbon solution. And we've grown really rapidly, particularly in the last year, as particularly district energy, district heating has come more to the fore. We're now up to over 130 members, grown rapidly. We've had 27 new members, so there's 27 companies have sought us out, or organisations have sought us out in the last year. And indeed, all the major district energy schemes in the UK are represented by ourselves. And we're looking forward to an exciting session today. We had over 120 of you registered to join the event, so very excited. In the centre of the association, we've got the scheme developers, owners and partners. Those are the full members of the association, but equally important around the outside, we've got the associate members. So those are the organisations that work with and support the full members, whether equipment suppliers, installers, consultants, service providers. They're all equally important. And together, we've created an incredibly strong and vocal network for district energy in the UK. So what do we offer? So we offer members lots of things. We give them the tools and support they need to develop and expand their schemes, whatever they may need. We're a respected voice for raising your concerns to government. I have a one-to-one with the Heat Networks Director each month to raise our concerns. We respond to consultations. We're respected as a consultee. We do circulate a 50-page monthly journal, which is literally feature-packed with everything about district energy. We have an annual conference at AGM, which has been supplemented over the last year by a large number of information and networking events, and I'll talk about 2 of those coming up in a moment. And we've also got a feature-packed website and a library that is in the process of being launched, a massive library of documents that members have access to in order to find out more about district energy. We've got a training register. If you haven't seen it, please visit our website. It's a very interesting document. There's over 40 different training courses offered by UKDEA members on the training register. And generally, we offer help, advice and support. I most probably have about half a dozen member meetings every month, talking to members about district energy issues. And people use me as the window into things that we've talked to them about, possibly in the journal or that are in the public domain, but simply they either don't know or they don't have the knowledge or the time to find. Essentially, together, we're a network of members working to assist each other and a voice for the sector. So why contracts and agreements? Well, it won't come up desperately clearly, I don't think, on your screen, but on the right-hand side, you'll see what I call an agreement map. So that's good practice to set one of those up for your project. So that maps out all of the different agreements that will be involved in developing your district energy scheme, be it supply agreements with your consumers, be it purchase agreements with your heat suppliers, be it people you're employing, O&M contractors, D&B contractors, or even, for example, this is a London Borough example agreement map, the relationship with your shareholder, your owner of your developing a local authority owned ESCO. So our projects by their nature are complex and involve multiple agreements, and often they're not well understood. And there's some complex guides on legal agreements, but they're not easy to digest. So there's little information that is available in easy to understand format. So today we're trying to give it to you in bite-sized chunks. So we've invited 2 UKDEA legal members, Nathan Bradberry from Bevan Britain and Christian from Clarion, to come along and talk to us about 2 different aspects. Nathan will be talking about the agreements involved with creating a scheme, and Christian will be talking about agreements involved with supplying energy. So please take part. So just explain how this event works. There's 2 tabs on the right hand side. There's one for chat and one for questions. if you have a question for any of our speakers, please put it in the questions tab and we will raise those at the end. So after our third speaker is Malcolm Ball. Malcolm's from the Department of Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, and he will talk about commercialising projects. As I was saying to Malcolm before the event started, I haven't seen his presentation, so really interested to see what BEIS are talking about today. And I think the really important thing is, please do ask questions in the question box, because it's not often you get a chance to ask a lawyer a question for free and you don't get a bill in return. So please do that. So future events, just a quick plug or quick raising for both members and non-members. So we've got one coming up this Friday at 2 p.m. Please contact the secretary if you haven't had an invite to that. This is talking to our members about what we've got planned for Future Build 2022. So we are sincerely hoping that we don't have another COVID surge come next March and that we can all go back properly to face-to-face events. So this is at the XL Exhibition Centre. It used to be called EcoBuild. In the recent years, it's called Future Build, and we're resurrecting a concept that we successfully ran for 3 years, which is a district energy area. We've already had a number of our members take exhibition stands. We'll be holding a small conference over each of the 3 days of the event. So it's very exciting both for members and non-members. But members, please do register for that event Friday 2 o'clock if you want to find out more. And then for anybody who's on the session this morning, so members and non-members, we're just finalising our next 2 events. One of those is a practical application of heat pumps with district energy network. So this is picking up from an event that we ran a couple of months ago, talking about utilising waste heat in district energy networks. This is about specifically applying heat pumps. And then the one after that will be looking at system optimization, so improving the efficiency of heat networks, reducing secondary network losses, etc., etc. So if you'd like to find out more about those events, but I'm sure as you're attending today, you'll get information from the secretary. But if you'd like to find out more, or as a member participate in those, please do let us know. So that's me, and I think I've said more than enough. So without further ado, I will invite Nathan Bradberry, partner at Bevan Britton, to join me on the stage and to present about creating a scheme. And Nathan will be inviting his colleague Simon Boyes to join him as well, a bit of a double out to code presentation. So over to you, Nathan. I'll leave you to it.
Thank you very much, Simon. And Simon Boyes, if you want to join me, feel free. Simon's going to be talking a bit later. So for those who don't know me, I'm Nathan Bradberry. I'm a partner in the energy team at Bevan Britton, a UK law firm. And I'm a specialist in the field of district energy and decarbonisation projects more generally. So on the slide there, I won't spend time introducing BB, but some brief snapshots on that slide. And you'll see my contact details, and those are my colleague Simon Boyes, who's going to be joining me later. He's a property specialist and we're covering off some of those considerations. And contrary to what Simon says, I do sometimes answer questions for free, so do take advantage of that today, and feel free to contact me following the session if you do have any queries. So for today's session, I'm going to be specifically focusing on concession agreements. Even just focusing on concession agreements is a very broad topic. Simon mentioned the agreement map, absolutely right, very, very important to start there, and covered some of the contracts that you generally come across with district energy projects. So in this presentation, we'll summarise what is a concession agreement and run through a number of the hot topics or key commercial principles that are typically debated on any given project, and a list of them there. I'll then hand over to my colleague Simon Boyes to cover off some of the property considerations that also underpin concession agreements. So firstly, an overview. What is a concession agreement? So a concession agreement in this context is the contract that gives an energy company, typically referred to as an ESCO, the right to operate a district energy business on a particular developer's site for an agreed period. Sometimes that can be as much as 25 to 50 years and subject to particular terms. The form of concession agreement itself, it will largely depend on which party is driving the project. There are a number of bespoke concession agreements circulating in the market. The majority of energy companies or ESCOs, they'll typically have their own agreements which they'll propose to the developer. A growing trend in my experience is developers now insisting on utilising its own form of concession agreement that it may have negotiated and developed from another analogous project. Particularly in London, we find where heat networks are more prevalent and not wishing to reinvent the wheel. Just moving on to project context and HOTs or heads of terms. I think what's important to appreciate here is no one size fits all. There are a number of variables which fundamentally alter the scope and the nature of the concession opportunity. Some of those variables are things like the stage of which the concession agreement is being let. Is it pre-planning, pre-construction? Is it during construction? Or is it adoption of a completed network? The apportionment of responsibility for design and construction of the energy network, I'll come on to talk a bit more about that. Is the relevant development being constructed over a number of phases, or will there be a single energy on date and adoption of the system in one go? And I'll come on to talk about other commercial terms that significantly alter the provisions required in the concession agreement shortly. I did want to spend a moment highlighting the importance of heads of terms. Given the number of variables that can apply to a project, I think that's crucially important to start with the heads of terms before preparing the formal concession agreement. There is a tendency or a keenness to get hold of a physical contract, and somehow that gives the parties more comfort. But by starting with the heads of terms, it does limit the parties negotiating the agreement through drafting, which inevitably, in my experience, leads to delays, costs, and strained relationships, which, contrary perhaps to popular opinion, is not an outcome that most lawyers want either. So moving on to these hot negotiation topics, starting with exclusivity of the network. So this is a fundamental key part of any concession agreement, particularly from the ESCO's perspective. The ESCO needs to be the sole provider of energy to that site, which will be the basis on which the ESCO's has put assumptions in its financial modelling. The creation of that monopoly, which is not expressly prohibited under current regulation, is the premise on which most concession agreements for district energy networks are based. And Christian will no doubt touch on that monopoly point in the context of supply contracts later on. In order to enshrine that exclusivity point, the ESCO will often require provisions that require the developer to ensure that no competing energy infrastructure is installed on the relevant site. So what would the ESCO should be interested in considering is whether that provision goes far enough, and is that within the developer or landowner's control? What happens if there's a disposal to part of the site to a third party? What can be done by the ESCO to protect that exclusivity agreement over 25 to 50 years in some cases? And my colleague Simon will pick up on that later. Equally, from a developer's perspective, there are certain elements which it will wish to carve out of that exclusivity promise. So exclusivity, for example, not applying where there are material or continuous interruptions in energy by breach of the ESCO. The developer will typically require a right to put in place its own alternative or temporary energy solutions until the situation is remedied. It may be agreed that exclusivity should not apply where it's commercially or technically not feasible to connect to the network. I've heard things like overdoor heaters or bespoke commercial unit fit-out solutions, but that can often be quite a contentious point. Going back to the fundamentals from the ESCO perspective, they want to be the sole provider of the energy on that site from its financial modelling perspective. Another exclusion that some developers may require, that some of you might have come across, is where particular commercial customers simply refuse to sign up to that exclusivity arrangement and insist on installing their own energy resilience. That can be the case on large retail developments in particular, in my experience. The developer will put significant pressure on the ESCO to accommodate that if there's a risk the developer could lose out on one or more anchor retail customers for its development. So moving on to the next topic, development build out and demand risk. Again, an extremely important topic for any concession agreement. Starting with the timing for the adoption. So in addition to an exclusivity, the ESCO will have made assumptions in its financial model in terms of when it can expect to adopt a system and begin receiving returns from customers. So the first question is, well, what happens if the development is significantly delayed, particularly in circumstances where the ESCO has invested capital expenditure up front, say in fit out of an energy centre, and has tied up capital or is incurring finance costs? The parties will need to agree the consequences of delays to the project and what, if any, remedy will be available to the ESCO to compensate it for its losses. That also assumes the ESCO has done everything it should have done in terms of installing its own infrastructure in that case. Moving on to demand risk, yet another key consideration. Demand risk is essentially the demand for energy and consumption on the network over time. How certain is the profile of demand or consumption and therefore revenue for the ESCO? In an example where a developer builds a residential estate, the ESCO will be expected to adopt and trigger energy on, start supplying energy once the first occupier is in situ. However, what happens if there's significant delay from the first purchase of a unit or dwelling to the last purchase? The ESCO will no doubt argue it should be compensated for that delay, as it being incumbent upon the developer to ensure that the units are marketed and sold in a efficient and speedy manner. Next topic, design and build responsibility. So key to this is who is responsible for the design and build of the energy infrastructure on the site? Does it sit all with the developer, or is there a mix between the ESCO and the developer? Typically, the developer will at least install what's commonly referred to as a secondary network, the risers and laterals of pipework within a building to the relevant units, the tertiary network, the equipment inside the relevant unit, heat interface units, radiators, and so on, and the energy centre building or the housing for the energy equipment. The ESCO will be keen to ensure in all that work being carried out by the developer that they comply with the specification typically issued by an ESCO to ensure efficiency of the system that it adopts, avoiding increased maintenance costs and heat losses, etc. So where the ESCO takes responsibility for fit out of an energy centre, it does open up a number of further considerations, and that interface between the developer works and the ESCO works. So things like managing build programmes, collaborating on site, rights to open up, what happens if delays caused by one party, the consequences of that delay need to be thought about and documented. In most cases, the developer will wish to hand over full responsibility to the ESCO once the network has been commissioned, including works carried out by the developer. The ESCO, on the other hand, will want to point to defects following adoption of the network where that's been constructed by the developer. And the solution to that conundrum will vary. One solution might be for the parties to agree that the developer remains responsible for defects in the network up to the expiry of a defects liability period, where it might have a design and build contract that it can require rectification, and then responsibility is handed over to the ESCO, provided that the ESCO is given appropriate collateral warranties, so it's got a direct right of recourse from the relevant parties, design and build contractors that have built or key subcontractors. Moving on again, adoption arrangements. So briefly, some key considerations for those adoption arrangements. What are the procedures for commissioning and testing and inspection by the ESCO? Very important to ensure compliance with the terms of the contract and the agreed technical specifications. Who is responsible for certifying the network on adoption? Is that the ESCO, or will there be an independent certifier? May be appropriate depending on the size of the scheme, and if an independent certifier is already engaged on the project, certifying other infrastructure, for example. And payment responsibility, what's the commercial dynamics there? Will the ESCO be expected to make adoption payments for the concession opportunity? Or where the ESCO has made investments in infrastructure and equipment to connect the site, will the ESCO require connection charges to be paid from the developer? So that all needs to be appropriately documented. Moving on, operational phase considerations. So at one level, the concession agreement terms may mean that the ESCO will be commercially incentivized, or it will mean that the ESCO will be commercially incentivized to make a success of the opportunity. And therefore, to a large degree, the developer may be relatively light touch on the operational terms, particularly where the developer is selling the site and moving on. However, where the procuring entity is a local authority or a developer who's going to be marketing the site over a number of years and phases, the local authority or developer will wish to ensure regular reporting on performance, things like customer complaints, tracking key performance indicators, service level guarantees, and ultimately things that could lead to the threat of termination of the ESCO if it's persistently and materially failing to perform. Particularly important, I think, from a local authority perspective, who may face the brunt of customer complaints, even if it's not in direct control of the circumstances there. Moving on again, default and termination, huge topic, not one that I'm going to spend much time for now going through, workshop in itself, but will require careful negotiation naturally. From the developer's perspective, of course, it will wish to have a number of performance-related triggers to hold the ESCO to task. From the ESCO's perspective, it will wish to ensure the developer's ground for termination are limited and subject to reasonable entitlements to rectify issues to avoid a last resort termination. That's particularly the case if you think these are very long-term agreements in some cases, and the ESCO may have made some large upfront investments or adoption of payments for the opportunity. Then finally, route to net zero and future-proofing. And that's something that we see has gone significantly up the agenda, particularly of local authorities, but more and more so developers, in the light of climate emergency, being seen as responsible, sustainable businesses, and seeking to ensure that developments are future-proofed, carbon efficient in light of the likely future regulation. And the parties will need to agree how to accommodate any future changes. Very complex often when you're dealing with very long-term agreements where technology will inevitably change. It may require, for example, variation to plant replacement at opportune moments, so where a major refurbishment of kit is due and there's perhaps an opportunity to switch investment to another alternative, lower carbon technology. And the parties will need to agree how those decisions will be managed and how the cost for that will be apportioned between the parties. So I appreciate that's a very whistle-stop tour of certain provisions, but hopefully it gives a sort of helpful overview of some of the key terms and I think why it's sensible, hopefully you'll see, to start with the agreed heads of terms before trying to document some of those key principles. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Simon, who's going to cover some of the property considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. So I will move past the collective groan at the mere mention of property law, and I'll try and deal with this as concisely as I can. So a concession agreement, as Nathan mentioned, should touch on property law in a number of ways. Firstly, it should deal with the energy company's rights of access and right to lay the infrastructure. Firstly, and most importantly, in respect to the development site, but also in respect of any third party's land that might be affected by the project. The agreement should also control how third parties who have land interests interact with the energy company's infrastructure and the consumption of energy from it. And finally, it should also ideally protect the energy company's interests at the land registry as well. And I'll touch on why that might be desirable in a moment. If we can flick onto the next slide. So access onto the development site will of course be of paramount importance. The developer will grant a license to the energy company to access the development site within the agreement in order that the energy company can carry out its obligations under the agreement and also for all purposes connected with the energy company's infrastructure. In some cases, it may well be appropriate for the energy company to take a lease of part of the development site for the purpose of housing some of the energy company's infrastructure. This might be done where, for example, the energy company will be installing a heat substation on the development site, and that may well need to be a separate consideration as part of the agreement itself. Access over third parties' land may also be necessary depending on the location of the development site itself relative to the wider heat network. And with that in mind, title due diligence is important to establish any need for access or other rights required for infrastructure or for work areas in respect of the land which is owned by third parties. Once that title due diligence has been undertaken, the need for and also the content of any deeds of easement, license agreements, leases should all be carefully considered to ensure that they do all that is necessary to give the energy company all of the rights and protections that it needs to effectively operate the network. So to facilitate the energy company's rights over third parties' land, a concession agreement should contain provisions which actually requires the developer to procure the grant of necessary easements and rights over third parties' lands to the energy company. So it's important for both the developer and the energy company to establish any need that there might be for easements or other rights as soon as possible within the life of the project. Moving on then, the concession agreement should also impose duties on the developer to control third parties' interaction with the infrastructure and supply of energy. One of the ways that it does that is through property documents. When the developer disposes of a land interest within the development site. So the concession agreement itself is a proprietary agreement, which means that it's personal to the energy company and the developer. With that in mind, it's important to think about what happens when the developer disposes of an interest in the development site. The agreement should contain provisions which requires the developer to include obligations within any transfer or lease out of the development site which protect the energy company's rights, so that firstly the energy company can continue to exercise its rights which are granted to it within the concession agreement, and also so that it can continue to perform its obligations under the agreement as well. Moreover, the provisions contained within any transfer or lease should require future owners of parts of the development site, whether they be a new developer, a tenant of a commercial unit, or a resident, to ensure that they are duty bound to comply with the with various obligations relating to the energy company's infrastructure. So this would be the tertiary infrastructure that Nathan touched upon. Forming part of the network to the extent that that might affect those individuals. And thirdly, the transfer or lease out of the development site should also contain provisions which obliges the future owners of parts of the development site, and again, whether that be commercial unit, dwelling, to enter into agreements relating to the consumption of energy from the network itself. And then finally, as I appreciate we're starting to run over time, it is generally desirable to protect the energy company's rights at the land registry This is because the concession agreement creates a contractual relationship which is enforceable between the developer and the energy company. But in order to back that up as an extra measure, it's also desirable to for the energy company to enter a restriction on the developer's title to the development site, which prevents the developer from dealing with the development site without the energy company being satisfied that the developer has included the various provisions within a transfer or lease arrangement, as I've mentioned in the previous slide. So by doing so, the energy company can exercise control to ensure that the developer requires that the person to whom the disposal is made continues to firstly allow the energy company to exercise its rights and obligations under the agreement, and also complies with their obligations, so that the individual unit owners' obligations relating to interaction with the infrastructure. There we go. So I see Simon has promptly joined, and I'll hand back over to him now.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Simon and Nathan, for a really good direct. So ask you to leave the stage now. So thank you very much indeed, and I'll ask Christian to join, and Christian will now be taking us into the next stage down, so to speak, and he will be taking us into the supply sector. So over to Christian. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Simon. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second part of today's second session of the Heat Networks Contracts Agreements event by the association. My name is Christian Hellmund. I'm a partner in the Energy Renewables Infrastructure Department of Clarion. Over the last 6-7 years, I've been working on numerous district heating schemes with different structures, project setups, including advising clients on regulatory issues, partly also on private wire networks. Like Nathan, more than happy to answer any questions after the event and be a sounding board if that's required. Just to give you a bit of an overview of Clarion itself, we're a full-service legal service provider operating from single site up in Yorkshire, Leeds. The firm has grown quite significantly over the last year, and we were named as one of the fastest growing firms in the UK, with now nearly over 300 staff. Coming to today's session, we're looking at heat supply agreements and some of the considerations in relation to those types of agreements. Also looking at a few differences between commercial supply agreements and residential supply agreements. And first of all, I'd like to take a look at some general considerations in relation to heat supply agreements. The name heat supply agreement may suggest that mainly heat is supplied under these types of agreements. However, the market use the types of agreements for a variety of purposes to also, in some parts, supply cooling, also supply electricity, or indeed a combination of the two of them. And with that, I'd like to spend a moment on looking at supply elements of electricity. And as you might imagine, the more supply elements you pack into these types of agreements, the more complex they get, and also the more tailoring they will need. If you've got different networks that come into play, such as electricity networks, then your agreements need to cater for that as well. Looking for a moment just at supply of electricity, if you were wanting to include that under these agreements. The supply of electricity is a regulated and licensable activity. You will find that mainly on schemes where there's a private wire network involved. and the supplier is looking to supply, in parts generate, distribute, supply heat and electricity to its domestic, non-domestic customers. Supplying electricity without a license is a criminal offence under the Electricity Act, unless you're exempt. There are some exemptions. They date back to an exemption order in 2001. This legislation is quite complex and difficult and is being reviewed by the government at the moment. Industry response has gone in a couple of months ago, and some of the association's members have contributed to that industry response. We're still waiting for a response back from the government, and hopefully there will be more flexibility in the legislation and the guidance that they're proposing. Hopefully also higher thresholds in relation to the supply of electricity to domestic customers. So remember, specific considerations need to be included if you're looking at supplying electricity under your heat supply agreement as well, in particular to domestic customers, that you're not falling foul of the regulations. The supply of heat itself, a heat supply in the market is considered to be a monopoly position. The supply of heat is also mainly an unregulated market, or considered to be an unregulated market. Back in 2017, the Competition Markets Authority launched a heat networks market study proposing greater protection for customers, in particular domestic customers. And the study looked at things like pricing, quality of service, transparency. One of the recommendations that came out of the study was to appoint Ofgem as a regulator for heat networks. That hasn't happened yet, but is likely to come in relatively soon. But also the outcomes of this study have focused heat suppliers' attentions to look more closely at consumer standards and particular requirements in residential heat supply agreements. There is now a clear distinction between commercial and residential supply agreements. There's clearly a recognition that the domestic consumer requires a much higher level of protection, and a set of residential heat supply agreements have evolved since then, in particular taking into account the findings of the Competition Markets Authority, including much greater transparency, clarity on pricing, taking into account heat trust principles as well, using plain language in residential supply agreements so that they're more consumer friendly, even though the broad structure of the commercial and heat supply agreements are relatively similar and address the same purpose, i.e. to sell heat at a certain price, quality and quantity. The documentation itself and the look and the feel of the documentation itself for residential supply agreements and commercial supply agreements is actually quite different, even though they do similar things. It is certainly advisable for heat suppliers, mainly if you're large suppliers such as an ESCO or a landlord, into a large mixed occupancy development with domestic, non-domestic customers, to have standardized documentation in place. They will, however, need to be tailored to suit the particular project, the risk appetite, risk allocation, commercial structure of the setup. Usually it tends to be that the commercial supply agreements need to be tailored more than the residential supply agreements, for example, to deal with things like void risk, or if you've got a particular entity such as a housing association, for example. Nathan previously talked about the overarching concession agreements, and the question here is how do the heat supply agreements link into the concession agreement? If you take, for example, a large management company that enters into a concession agreement with the landlord, usually the management company will want control and in part even dictate the form of the supply agreement, because usually it's the management company that will have entered into leases, and under the leases it has an obligation that it procures the supply of utilities, and usually as part of that is also the supply of heat. So some level of control will want to be used by the management company in order to control what the landlords are doing. So the supply agreements are usually then templates which are appended to the concession agreement itself. Then looking at commercial supply agreements and an overview, I've split these into two separate elements. The first one are the very tailored, bespoke supply agreements, and here it's usually the energy generator that will enter into a form of supply agreement with an off-taker, and that off-taker may be a heat supplier. Usually the arrangement is a form of a bulk supply arrangement. Here, by way of an example, I've used an energy from waste operator that enters into a commercial supply agreement with for its excess heat to be used on a district heating scheme. These types of agreements are usually very tailored. They include in parts design and build elements, connection adoption elements. Certain milestones need to be achieved by certain dates. There will be ramifications in the agreements to ensure what happens if such milestones aren't achieved. As you might imagine, the primary focus of the energy from waste operator is not to supply heat to a district heating scheme. They're dealing with waste, and so the waste heat is only really a byproduct of the whole operation. So there usually is then also an interplay between the electricity and heat generation. In particular, if the energy from waste plant uses a steam turbine, there is what's called the Z ratio, which is the ratio of heat extracted from the steam turbine to the reduction of electricity output. Hence, there's a loss of electricity generation there. I'm not particularly technical. Simon can probably answer these questions better than I can. However, the type of arrangement that is weaved into commercial supply agreements on a very bespoke basis will include these types of mechanisms to deal with the Z ratio. Then looking at other types of standardized agreements, here the heat supplier, the landlord management company or an ESCO will be supplying to multiple commercial customers on their side that are connected to the district heating network. These forms tend to take a more standardized form as commercial supply agreement. I'd now like to look at some of the common considerations, negotiation points in commercial supply agreements. I've only picked a couple of themes here. It's not an exhaustive list, as you might imagine. There are a lot others that need to be considered. But starting off with exclusivity, usually the development company and then ultimately also the heat supplier will have invested a lot of money into the district heating scheme, and they will want to ensure that they realize their investment through the sale of heat. So what they don't want is to customers to go off and obtain their own heat supply by the installation of either their own systems or by connection to the gas networks. So pretty tight restrictions are usually included in these types of contracts. However, it's in part a contested area where certain commercial customers have specific requirements. Take, for example, a manufacturer that might require the heat from the district heating system as a base load. However, requires a much higher temperature for their operations, so that will require a certain carve-out to the exclusivity. Other examples might be where already within the design and build envelope of the development itself, for example, certain hot water points have been installed in kitchens, communal areas, and if there is a blanket carve out, then certainly this element needs to be carved out of the exclusivity. Otherwise, the commercial customer will be in breach of the supply agreement. Another area are supply interruptions. So here's what happens if the supply of heat is interrupted due to a planned, unplanned maintenance emergency, for example. Usually the drafting and the contracts caters for various scenarios with rectification periods and certain timeframes. In most circumstances, the heat supplier will not want to give up control of dealing with the rectification of such interruptions. So as you might imagine, also if there is an outage of any form, it will affect most, if not all, the customers on the district heating network. Usually the supply agreements will have compensation mechanisms included in them. For various commercial customers, the financial compensation will, however, not be sufficient to cover their financial losses in case of an interruption. So there are then also certain businesses that have certain business critical needs to get supply, say for heating and cooling backup, and for the system to be up and running as soon as possible. For example, supermarkets or shops that have freezers. So they would be looking to negotiate carve-outs to have a self-help remedy in order to bring on site their own backup systems, and then also to get relief from their payment obligations under the agreement. From a heat supplier's perspective, there may also be specific elements that need to be included, where the heat supplier requires space to bring backup generation onto site, and that might require the customer's cooperation to get access to their site, and it may not always be possible. Certain businesses might be difficult due to security reasons. So as you might imagine, there's quite a bit of tailoring for those types of scenarios to be included, and quite a bit of negotiation going on to make it work for all parties. Then looking at carve-outs or alternative supply arrangements, this may be specific carve-outs that I've just explained under the supply interruptions. So hereby a customer can bring their own backup generation onto site and get relief from payment obligations under the agreement. Certain force majeure events as well. These are usually acts of God, where for a long period of time the customer may need to be given a self-help remedy to bring their own backup boiler on site. And usually these agreements tend to be long-term agreements, so the ability to terminate is very restricted, but that also gives the customer a justification for some forms of alternative and self-help remedies. So that brings me on to looking at residential supply agreements. These are, as said before, relatively similar in structure to commercial supply agreements. I would say they're probably at this stage in a more standardized form than commercial supply agreements, and that's down to the fact that they've taken into account the findings from the Competition Markets Authority, also heat trust requirements. So for those of you who don't know, in order to obtain heat trust compliance status, you usually make an application to the heat trust and have your residential supply agreement reviewed by the heat trust. They will then look at transparency, pricing, itemization of say, for example, the unit charge, the usage charge, how these are made up, and generally your welcome pack documentation as well, to ensure that the customer has all the information they need before entering into a long-term supply agreement. Usually what the heat trust won't do is they will look at unfair terms in those agreements. What they won't look at is the pricing itself. Heat trust compliance, obviously, for suppliers is it is great. Once you've got the badge, it will give commercial and residential customers a much better, a greater confidence that you're complying with the terms and that your agreement is fair. It uses plain English and is much more customer friendly, and usually it has service levels, service failures, compensation mechanisms set up. It also usually includes particular types of policies, for example, for vulnerable customers, the setting up of priority lists and taking into account age, disability, illness, and that such customers, for example, get priority services, for example, faster response times in case of supply interruptions. With that, that was a very quick whistle-stop tour through some elements in commercial supply agreements, residential supply agreements, but happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Christian, and thank you for pretty much keeping us to time, and a very good and interesting run through all of those questions on the side. If you could look at those, that'd be wonderful. So thanks very much, Christian. I'll ask you to leave the stage, come back on for the Q&A at the end. And if I could now ask Malcolm Ball to join us on the stage. Malcolm is from BEIS, and he will be covering options for commercialisation and particularly Beehive. So thanks very much, Malcolm, and over to you.
Simon, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a great day, and looking forward to going back to the office sometime soon, if you're not already in the office. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that relate to the later stages of project development, where we have recognised within BEIS there may be some more support required, and maybe perhaps some different approaches that could be adopted. So you may not have heard of Beehive, and that's principally what I'd like to talk about for about 10 minutes or so. So for those of you who know the Heat Network Investment Project, we established a funder forum for that project, and the idea was that we would be able to introduce projects to the funders and funders to the projects. But it quickly became clear that there were a lot of public procurement regulations that could be infringed if the wrong approach was taken. And so we took the decision to establish a platform where providers of capital and services for the final stage of commercialization of a project and projects looking for third-party investment could come together in a public procurement safe environment, as it were. And for those of you who are not familiar, the platform is a dynamic purchasing system, which means that suppliers can come on and off the platform at relatively short notice. And at the moment, we have about 8 equity providers on the platform interested in putting equity into, and debt possibly, into district heating schemes being developed by principally local authorities. The platform is not available for those in Scotland, and I think there are a couple of people from Scotland on the call at the moment. It's only for those in England and Wales. And whilst it was born out of the Heat Network Investment Project, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, it isn't actually a part of that project. It's a separate initiative, although it is being run by the same company that's our delivery partner for the Heat Network Investment Project, and that's Triple Point. And they do have, if you go to Triple Point, they do have a section on their website around the Heat Network Investment Project and a separate page on Beehive, which you can go to for more information. The platform will run till about December 22, and then we'll have to decide what we do with it then. If it's been working, then we probably won't change much, but we'll just keep it going. If it needs some adjustment, we'll be looking at that probably 6 months beforehand. So just to reiterate, it's a dynamic purchasing system, and what if as a procurer of or not yes, as a procurer of equity investment, Triple Point will provide services to you to support you onto the platform and help you get your project in the right shape to be seen by potential investors. And the platform can be used for soft market testing, but again, there are some principles over how well developed the project needs to be. In principle, it should be at the back end of feasibility study and very close, if not in the commercialization phase. So why did we I want to touch back on a little bit now, why did we establish Beehive in the first place? And it's partly to do with the fact that increasingly local authorities have got to the end of commercialization phase and realized that now they know what they're really in for, they're not particularly interested in putting all the capital in, and there might be a nervousness on the part of the senior directors within the local authority to go it alone. And that's not unusual. A lot of investors, in my experience, like to participate in projects with other people, with other organizations that can bring strengths to that particular project. So this is a platform that would allow local authorities to meet equity investors interested in their projects, and crucially, through the platform, they can secure services in a public procurement safe way to help support the final stages of commercialization of that project. And if an applicant has been to the Heat Network Investment Project and secured support for the commercialization phase of their project, or in future to the Green Heat Network Fund for the same purpose, then there will be a pool of capital that can be used between the two partners in the project, or if not, there may be more in the project to cover that final commercialization phase. So it's not about the equity investor spending a lot of time and effort supporting the development of project. That is possible, but if there's money available from the government to support that phase, and I think people would find that quite attractive. What we're rather hoping is that this will help projects overcome some, or provide another avenue for commercialization of projects beyond that which is normally adopted and beyond the normal conventional concession model that was being described earlier on, because it will be a joint venture between a private investor, probably taking a majority share, and the local authority, still retaining quite a bit of control over the project, still retaining or benefiting from some dividend return for their aspect of the investment, but having some confidence that there's a private sector partner alongside them, bringing a different set of skills and experience to help them close out the final stage of the project, knowing that once that's closed out, that partner will bring the construction finance to help build the project. So just in summary, it provides access to a private source of capital. It also provides access to a set of skills, both commercial and financial, and people who are familiar with dealing with the sort of contracts that my other panelists have been speaking about for the last half an hour or so. And crucially also allows the local authority to retain some interest in the project, which is so important these days. So there's some return going back to the local authority, and the project is relatively de-risked from their point of view, in that they have someone else to share the risk with them and share that burden. So there's two aspects of the platform. There is lot one, which is equity finance, and lot two, which is asset finance. Lot one is, I think, open and ready, and I think there is one project which they Triple Point are preparing to go through on a soft market testing basis. But there are two options for approaching Beehive. The first one is to approach Beehive when someone is looking for a strategic partner at the late stage of feasibility study, early stage of commercialization, and they're looking for a lot of expertise and a lot of support to take the project through to conclusion. And that is probably where people will get this benefit from the platform, and that's where the equity partners can provide the most support and the greatest benefit. But it's also quite possible to approach the platform at any time during commercialization or at the end of commercialization, when the amount of work required from the equity partners is really just making sure the risk profile is appropriate for them and that they're happy to put the investment in. So it just because a local authority doesn't start the process straight after feasibility at the early stage commercialization doesn't mean to say they've missed the boat. There is plenty of opportunity to join the platform and seek some support at any stage in the process. But it's important, I think, to start before one starts that process, and this is one of the advantages of the platform, is to really make sure that the objectives of the project and the objectives of the local authority have been tested, so that people know exactly what they want out of the project and want from the arrangement with an equity partner. And having that test at the beginning of commercialization means that a lot of wasted time and effort can be avoided, which sometimes happens through that commercialization phase, building an outline business case, which once the directors and the members of the local authority have seen it, are not happy to proceed on that basis, and then the whole process is delayed and has to restart. So I think pushing that decision stage decision stage earlier on in the process will fundamentally help projects to be more secure when they do come to market. I did briefly mention that projects need really to have some substance to them before they approach the market and before they approach the platform, even for soft market testing. And I've put on this slide just some of the things that we believe will be extremely important in the in the criteria that we're looking for from a particular project. I'll leave you to go through that on your own at some stage in the future. So this isn't exclusively to local authorities, although I have spoken only of local authorities. Devolved administrations, well, certainly Wales can use it, NHS bodies, universities, and central government can use it as well. So it's anybody that's got an interest in public procurement regulations and wants to make sure that they get an equity partner without contravening those regulations. And one of the things I did want to mention also is if people have not seen the Womble Bond Dickinson report entitled Heat Networks Procuring Finance, it's something which if you are looking to get a private sector partner in, it's a good read, but it's a well worth a read to understand where you might contravene the regulations and to make sure you understand what you're doing. Simon, I think I've got you back on track. That may have been a bit shorter than you expected. I may have caught you out. There we go.
No, that was very helpful indeed, Malcolm. Thanks very much. I think all speakers had a couple of minutes extra apart from you, Malcolm, so thanks very much for getting us back on track. So Tom, if we could pull Malcolm's presentation off, thanks very much indeed. And if I could invite Nathan, Malcolm, Christian and Simon to rejoin the stage. Christian, are you there as well, particularly for questions? And Malcolm, I'll wait and see whether Christian can rejoin. That would be very helpful if we could. While we're waiting for Christian, Malcolm, there we go. I'll immediately dive straight into the questions. So, Nathan, you've had plenty of time to look at them. So, as any good lawyer, you'll be well versed in a good, clean response, I hope. So, if we can try and keep it brief, but I'd really like to work through all of them if possible. So, the first one from Andrew Toffs: exclusivity is great for new builds, but how does that work in retrofit situations where people already have an energy supply?
Yeah, I think Christian gave a written response to that one, which I agree with. So exclusivity for now on heat and cooling is key normally to the financial modelling. So even on retrofit, the project tends to need to find a way to design it so that even if it's retrofitting heat cooling solutions, that we need to get to that exclusivity position, or there's some other modelling that means that the ESCO can live without that. But I agree with Christian. For now, the regulations allow it, and normally ESCOs insist on it to basically stack up the deal.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much. So then moving on to Arshad Ali's question about the adoption model and D&B liability under collateral warranties, where the contractor offering the defects liability becomes insolvent. Nathan, have you come across that before? Very,
very good question. My answer to that depends on who I'm advising, of course, naturally, like I'm a good lawyer. But yeah, it's ultimately a commercial point of play. It depends on the dynamics of commercial leverage. From the developer's perspective, they would say, yeah, okay, we selected the D&B contractor, but they know what they're doing. They're a company of substance. We're buying the solution. We're tendering a number of ESCOs. We want an ESCO to take on that risk, basically. Would be their position, but I can see it from the ESCO's point of view as well. Is your D&B contractor, they've gone insolvent, we can no longer claim from them, but it's a risk that in my experience more often than not an ESCO might have to take a view on.
Okay, and then the one from Mark: normal that client developer accepts the risks associated with change of laws in the future. So how would change the law normally fall, do you think, Nathan?
Yeah, another excellent question, and a really hot topic because of the future change in regulation as well. Again, just depends on the commercial dynamic, but typically the bottom line is the ESCO isn't making truckloads of money, the margins are tight. If there's a significant change in law that undermines the ESCO's ability to wash its face or make money, then the project's going to fail. So there needs to be a route for the ESCO to pass on changing law cost. And the first point of call would normally be for the customers. They're the ones using the system. That's the cost of using the system. But there may be circumstances, particularly in the development phase, where the developer is still constructing, still might have plots that it can pass on connection charges to accommodate or mitigate some of that change in law risk. But yeah, a workshop in itself.
Okay. Yep. No, I think there's lots of possible workshops after this one. So the one from Stephen McGill, Nathan, that still fits within your remit. Issues with passing infrastructure adoption.
Interesting on that. I'd be happy for anyone on the panel to give their view. I haven't specifically come across it. It's sort of I've seen the bottom line is the ESCO needs to adopt the system and take responsibility for the system. But I see no reason why the ESCO couldn't then subcontract that responsibility of adoption onto a third-party contractor. That's possible. I've not come across it. I don't know if others have, but because on the ones I've sort of come across, it's typically dealt with in-house or they don't get the lawyers involved. But yeah, it's quite possible.
Christian, any thoughts on that, or should we move on to the next question?
I've not come across it either.
Okay, no worries. Oh, there's a property one there from Arshad Ali again. Maybe that fits with yourself, Simon Boys. Reserve rights to relocation to the network. How would you respond to that? Is that yourself or more Nathan?
Yeah, no, I think those probably sits within my remit. So yes, that's an understandable thing that a developer might want to do. It is something that a developer it's the question has posed, almost certainly want to build into the agreement. Ideally, from the energy company's point of view, you would want to ensure that right to effectively lift and shift the infrastructure is subject to ensuring no interruption in the supply. So that there's a legal obligation on the developer not to do so. Again, ideally, actually, it would be developer requests that ESCO actually affects the lift and shift, meaning that the developer's got control over the actual rerouting of any infrastructure. And one final thing that might be put into a concession agreement to deal with this point is potential compensation resulting from any interruption in the supply caused by the developer rerouting or interrupting the supply of heat through the network.
Okay, lovely. Thanks very much indeed. Moving on to yourself, Christian, I see you've responded to Chris Glover about the combining agreements. Did you want to expand on that, or should we move on to the next one?
I can do. Obviously, it always is dependent on the underlying project itself and the drivers, and mainly where you would combine the agreements for heat and power is probably where you're dealing with a private wire network. There it seems to make sense. There is obviously an ability for the customer to change electricity suppliers where you're dealing with a private wire network. That is possible. The operator has to let other electricity suppliers onto their network. However, in most cases, in practice, it's probably a bit more difficult. The end customer may be stuck with the supplier there. So in those circumstances, it might make sense to combine the two. Usually, I would say it's probably advisable to have separate agreements.
Okay, no problem. So the question from David McIntyre, Christian, I'll put to you, but Nathan, you might want to also touch on this with respect to concession agreements and how this might go through concession agreements. So Christian, this is about a property owner request to be connected from a district heating system in order to install their own equipment, presumably because of the inability of the heat supplier to provide a proper service. So what thoughts do you have on that particular question, Christian?
So again, this comes into the discussions on exclusivity, obviously, and again, particular carve-outs where take, for example, a manufacturer that again requires a different service from the heat supply. So whether the disconnection then is possible under the agreement, or whether a termination doesn't determination right doesn't exist in those circumstances. It might be that the heat load or the base load may need to be taken from that from the heat network. However, a separate system may be carved out such that the commercial customer can then install something that is suitable for their requirements. But again, it will depend on the negotiation between the parties.
Thanks very much. Nathan, did you want to jump in with any thoughts on this, or should we move on to the next question?
Well, I suppose very briefly, you want to avoid that at all costs for all parties' perspective to ensure the ESCO is happily supplying energy. But if the ESCO is in default, significantly and persistent failings, then it depends what the concession agreement ultimately says in the supply agreements. But most developers will insist on an Armageddon scenario where landowners are entitled to do that, but it should be a last resort, and it should be sort of protected as far as possible.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. So the next question from William, sort of happy to throw open to the floor, because this is quite an intriguing one. So this is about the customer wants the mechanism to ensure heat supply will be capped at that of the gas border counterfactual, but we're all aware that there's new forms of heating decarbonisation coming in. So do any of the panel have any thoughts about how that could be dealt with under the district heating, commercial district heating supply agreements? It's a challenge I'm throwing down to anybody who feels able to pick up a response on that particular one. Hopefully one of you will, Nathan or Christian possibly.
I think it's certainly an interesting one and hot topic. I would have thought again from an ESCO's perspective or heat supplier's perspective, you wouldn't really want this in the agreement, but ESCOs will also have to look into the future, and changes may need to be included. So certain carve-outs of exclusivity may need to be discussed.
Okay.
Yeah, I just echo that, and I don't think it really works from a project's perspective. I think it's about the certain an appropriate benchmarking or capping is probably not that counterfactual. There's a number of variables and factors that mean that that's not a very good comparison. It will very much depend on the project, and most ESCOs will really struggle with that concept, which is no doubt the root from the question. So it's about educating, I think, the customer about how the pricing works, what fair pricing looks like on that project, and the other benefits of having a district energy scheme that, in the longer term, the whole cost benefits to the individual customer. But a tricky one. Good question.
Okay, no, thanks very much. I think it's reflective of the very evolving market we're all working in these days. So Malcolm, you've been quiet today, so I'll throw you into the mix. Donna has asked you a question about the examples of legal obligations that were used by local authorities. Are you okay to pick up that question from Donna, Malcolm?
I did see the question from Donna, and thank you for that question, Donna. I'm not really the right person to answer that because I've got no experience of that. I don't know if Nathan or Christian have. I mean, clearly it's in the interests of the local authority to have as much load as possible, but how it's obligated, I don't know. But what I would say is that that's not necessary to go forward to the Beehive platform. People can enter the Beehive platform and they don't need those sort of obligations in place. It just may make the deal that much richer, but they don't need it in the first place.
Okay. Nathan or Christian?
Particular positive obligations in agreements in relation to this, but they're usually arrangements, but it's agreements to agree in relation to expansion funds. So yeah, not seeing positive obligations.
Yeah, I agree with that. So if you've got an agreement in place, like a development agreement for lease as a council, you can dictate some terms to the developer if that's possible. But other than that, it's really about planning, local planning policy, and certain councils have dictated that, you know, certain developers will need to connect it, part of the old Section 106 regime, for example. But planning policy, as many will know, is being overhauled somewhat. So watch this space. But I think for the success of district energy networks and connect and legally obliging developers to connect, I think some of the answers could be through planning policy going forward. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. So the next question is from Paul Simpson, a very interesting one. So Simon and or Nathan and or Christian, I'll leave you to come in once I've read it. So heat services agreements are fine in principle. There's little protection for the property owner freeholder for error payers, as disconnection is not possible. Intriguing assumption. What stronger checks can be applied, especially for the residential market? So who wishes to go first?
Shall I go first? Obviously it's a difficult one, dealing with bad debts and those types of residential customers that aren't able to pay or are not willing to pay. Obviously there are elements of vulnerable customers that require larger protections. You could, for example, include prepayment meters that those are installed, and work with those. However, disconnection as such isn't really possible. That is correct. We've worked on various bad debt payment plans that are being negotiated with residential customers to help them out of difficulties. Prior checks of the customers are sensible to see their financial strength, but it's generally a difficult one in the market.
Okay, Nathan, did you have any thoughts on this one?
Nothing much more to add to that. I completely agree with all of that. The other things ESCOs do, as I understand it, is factor in a bit of bad debt risk into their modelling. So, you know, depending on the relevant site, and I'll probably throw it open to you, Simon. I suppose there's technical ways to disconnect simply, but Christian's point's right. That's not always possible if you're dealing with vulnerable customers and so on. But yeah, it's something that the ESCO has to accommodate, really.
I think clearly disconnection is, from my perspective, I see it as very, very, very much last resort. And clearly, you know, vulnerable customers sit into a complete compartment of their own. But I think outside of vulnerable customers, I'm very concerned that there are certainly some schemes in the UK where it seems to become custom and practice to take heat for free without fear of disconnection. And I think personally, as long as you follow a proper credit control suspension, and then ultimately as an incredibly last resort disconnection policy, and you have the means to disconnect built into the scheme, I don't see why you would not disconnect. I mean, let's be honest with you, if you don't pay for your Sky TV or you don't pay for your electricity, ultimately at the end of the day, you will be disconnected from the network. Disconnections are really a last resort minimised, but if you don't have that as a result, then I am aware of some schemes where customers are simply taking advantage of that and essentially obtaining free heat, which is not fair or reasonable to the heat supplier. So that's my view. So Dan Goodchild has asked a question about how should a local authority wishing to let a concession contract, which sounds like something for you, Nathan, incentivise require a concessionaire to expand the phase one network? So this is a slightly different type of concession contract from the one that you talked about primarily in your talk. So this isn't a developer ESCO one, this is a local authority employing an ESCO under a concession agreement, and how they get that expansion once they've picked the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, a really good question. I'll try and be as brief as possible because we could talk for a long time about this point. I suppose this goes to what Malcolm was saying about, you know, how do local authorities take forward schemes, drive schemes forward, where they've got a private sector partner providing equity. Sometimes they can be providing quite a lot of the equity and taking the lion shareholding of the project going forward. So how does the ESCO, how does the local authority let a concession type arrangement, get private sector partner in who's investing equity and might have debt funders behind it? How do you get that party to then do some of the other objectives that authorities want, like addressing fuel poverty? So it might not be very cost effective to take some more pipe out to a particular area to try and access some low-income families suffering from fuel poverty, but that might be an objective of the council. The bottom line, in my experience, rightly or wrongly, is that equity funders, will basically try and protect their projects as much as possible. Those are our returns. We want stable returns. We understand the authority's position. If you want us to do that, we're going to need to try and get to the same level of returns. We're not a charity. We've structured a project around on this basis. So there are ways and means of the authority to do it, but it probably does mean putting their hands in their pocket, in my experience.
Okay, then, Malcolm, please. I see you've got.
So this is one of the curious this plays to one of the really curious aspects of heat network projects, is that predominantly they are looked as a project finance approach, and that's what Nathan and Christian have been talking about largely when they've been addressing the contracts. But if we are truly to decarbonise the UK, and certainly the areas where heat networks ought to be economic and ought to be the right solution, then increasingly we are going to need to have an element of a heat network project which is more about an ordinary business, where there's some upside in it. But quite how we're going to get there, it's not clear. People on the call may be familiar with the zoning consultation, which I think we have released, or certainly some of the discussions and research work we're doing on zoning, which may allow networks to develop within the zone because of planning and because of obligations, etc. But there will need to be this hybrid arrangement with where new loads can come on, but there will always be the issue that the original investors in their project who have a certain return won't want that return diluted, and so it may mean that the local authority has to subsidise that part of the project, or maybe central government has to. So it's an area to watch out for, and it's a really interesting area. And to see how this is going to develop, which it must do if these heat networks are going to fulfil their true potential.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Malcolm. We got 3 questions left, and I'm conscious we've still got a large number of people online, so we'll carry on as long as we've still got an audience, which is great news. So the question from Arafat Hussain, sorry if I've mispronounced your name. So this is, I think the question relates to the fact of whether you should set the energy at the start of the contract to be frozen, or should it be tied into a gas price index? I mean, I personally have not heard of the contract prices being frozen for the duration of the contract, and typically they're indexed. I don't know whether Nathan or Christian, you've got other thoughts or similar thoughts?
I concur with that. I've not seen any pricing being frozen. I suppose typically concession type agreements tend to be quite a long period, anywhere from up to 25 years and beyond. So to have it frozen would be unusual, I'd say. Yeah. So what the index is, I think that does vary on deal to deal. I've not specifically sort of advised or considered the gas pricing index being an appropriate one, but
okay.
Yeah. Likewise from my side. Obviously, what we also see and put in is that the pricing is revised once or twice a year. I mean, that's capped sometimes, the times of revision, but I've not seen prices being frozen. I mean, obviously it would be nice from a customer perspective, but I think that's
Okay, cool. Final 2 questions. So the one from John O'Shea and Joel Debson. They sound more commercial, but if any of the panel have some thoughts on those. So this is, it goes back to the John's question about the point earlier. So this is this brave new world we're operating in. So sort of post gas-fired CHP district energy schemes where we were all sort of using a gas counterfactual. So whether the panelists have come across a new or sort of future home standard indexation mechanism, so carbon tax rates or other industries that capture the benefits, or is this still all a bit too new and shiny and we're still all trying to find our feet post the gas world? Any thoughts, Nathan or Christian?
I mean, I like the idea, but I certainly haven't come across it yet. But I can see that. I can see, reference to, avoidance of carbon taxing and things like that coming into the pricing calculations going forward. But no, I've not come across that. No.
Okay.
And I've seen it on some CHP projects where carbon pricing is being pushed onto the customer, but I've not really seen it in these types of projects. It's too new, I think. The level of green gas in the network probably is far too small. We're still quite far away from green hydrogen networks as well. So once that comes in, I think there may be a shift.
Okay, and the final one, standard for calculating bad debt provision. That sounds a bit of a commercial one, but whether any of our panel have got a view on what a reasonable level of bad debt is, I'm happy to cover it off if any of the panel don't have a question.
I'll take a punt on 3%, but you can't. No one rely on that.
No, I typically would have heard sort of typically 2%. I think generally it comes down to the contractual structure that you've put in place and your ability to operate a suspension, disconnection and debt recovery policy. So it's very poor. Then you need to factor in a much higher level of bad debt. But typically I'm seeing in the market something like 2%. And we do have one final question popped in before we close the event. Is the local authority doing anything to incentivise existing network owners to allow for new connections outside of the burdening of the new connector with an obligation? So, Malcolm, that almost sounds like one for you. If you're not frozen, it sounds a bit like it falls under the heat network zoning category. I think is that where you're seeing that one?
Well, so it plays to the point of how do we expand these networks to their full potential, where there is a density of heat load that justifies it, and zoning may provide the answer in the long term. It's certainly something which we're looking at in a great deal of interest. I don't know what traditional in the interim period until that comes into force, if indeed it does come into force, because it's really under consideration at the moment. I think there is only the Section 106 and planning obligations. But what I would say is that from looking at some of the heat network investment projects that have come through, there has been acceleration away from gas, and building owners are now saying, we're hearing building owners saying, we don't want to connect to the network if it's a gas-fired network, but we will if it's a lower carbon heat source. So there is an element, because building owners now are trying to decarbonize too. So there is an element of, if you get the heat network carbon content right, people will want to connect to it because their alternative to decarbonize their heat supply could be a lot more expensive if they went for an individual heat pump rather than connect to the network. So in other words, instead of it being a financial play against gas, it's the counterfactual is, what else could I do to achieve the same low carbon heat supply? And if the heat network's been configured well, it could well be the best play in town, and therefore people will want to connect to it because it's a better economic solution. Certainly, if you take into account upfront costs. Simon, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, apologies for that. Nathan and Christian, any final closing comments before I wrap up?
I think Malcolm's hit the nail on the head there. Local authorities, if they're procuring networks, doing it in a way that is attractive from a decarbonisation perspective, if not a commercial perspective, and people want to connect, I think is spot on. I think that's a good place to end it.
Good, excellent. No, well, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to all the delegates who've stuck with us. We've still got a large number online, and thanks very much indeed for your questions. And a big thanks to all the speakers. And thanks to you all for attending our event this morning. So thanks very much, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.